Okay, hi everyone. We are joined today by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and also a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. So the United States and its allies have for many years allied itself with various terrorist groups to topple the Syrian government. They finally succeeded at the end of 2024, and over the past few months, we've seen Western governments seeking to normalize the relationship with the terrorist leader Golani, who now leads Syria. Trump calls him an attractive and a tough guy with a very strong past, which is an interesting way of referring to this Al-Qaeda, ISIS branch. And the media consistently describes Jolani and the new Syrian government as former terrorists who are now reformed. So it looked as if they were being embraced by the West. They might still be, but now Israel, of course, is attacking the new authorities in Syria. So, Professor Marandi, I was wondering what to make of this. Is the former partnership between Israel and Jolani over? And if so, how will this impact the wider partnership between Syria and the West?
Well, first, I want to point out that the Israeli regime has always had an interest in destroying neighboring countries and having them weak and fragmented so that it could rule supreme over the region. It has always done that to Lebanon. It's done that regularly against Syria, Jordan, and of course, Egypt. And it has always had an interest through the United States in destroying other countries like Iraq, Libya, any country that has any power or strength or wealth that could be a problem for Israeli supremacy is targeted. Iran, of course, has been targeted since the revolution. Now, I just want to remind your viewers about a couple of things regarding Syria. And that is that before 2011, when this dirty war began, um, it was discussed among policymakers in the United States and government officials uh, as to how to undermine Syria. And but more importantly, though, in the region, Syria had very good relations with its neighbors. President Assad, or former President Assad, and Erdogan had excellent relations. They would go on vacation together with their families. So Syria had a much closer relationship with Turkey than it did with Iran. Iran's relationship with Syria was basically the Syrians allowing Iran to support the Palestinian resistance and the resistance in Lebanon through its territory. Iran had very little to do with what goes on inside Syria, and the trade was always very limited. Even in recent years, it was limited. Iran basically gave aid to Syria during the Dirty War. Then in 2011, when the Dirty War began, we saw Erdogan change completely. He joined Obama in the Dirty Wars, which began, of course, in Libya. And Al Qaeda was used in Libya. Qatar was deeply involved. And then after Libya, they moved on to Syria. And the main uh, focus or the main center for undermining Syria was in Turkey. And also, of course, in Jordan, but mostly Turkey. So suddenly, this relationship, which was excellent, the Qataris had investments in Syria. Qatari leaders had homes in uh, members of the ruling family had homes in Syria or small palaces in Syria. So that relationship suddenly changed. And of course, we know of the infamous email by Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. The same Al-Qaeda that carried out 9/11, according to the official narrative, uh, like they, a decade later, were on the U.S. side. And of course, before that, they were on the U.S. side in Libya as well, through Turkey, through Qatar, and of course, other oil and gas-rich countries in the Persian Gulf. But I think it's fair to say now, after Mohammed bin Salman came to power, for whatever reason, he has distanced himself to a large degree, from these Salafist, Takfiri groups, and they're now mostly backed and supported and trained by a Qatari Turkish coalition. But after the dirty war began, and of course the United States doesn't do dirty wars in this region without having full coordination with the Israeli regime. So this was an Israeli-American operation to undermine Syria. Iran at that time was concerned, but it had nothing to do with what was going on in Syria. Iran was saying that this is a dirty war. Iranian intelligence agencies knew what was going on. They declared it, but Western media, they were supporting the so-called Syrian revolutionaries and what later became known as the Free Syrian Army, and they were saying this is all nonsense. By 2013, tens of thousands of foreign fighters had already poured into Syria. And Al-Qaeda and then ISIS became huge and powerful groups. And there were also Jaish al-Islam and other groups as well, which were affiliated and with these groups. Sometimes they were at war with each other, sometimes they were allies. But in any case, there were many different groups, but all of them Takfiri, Salafists, that were funded largely by family dictatorships in the American camp in the Persian Gulf region, Turkey, the Israeli regime. They were funding these Takfiris alongside the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. And whenever the Syrian army would try to attack them, they would often strike the Syrians themselves. So not only would they support ISIS and Al-Qaeda alongside that area, but they would all get involved themselves. Sometimes they'd strike Iranians as well. So you had this broad coalition, and then these tens of thousands of foreign fighters came from across the region and beyond, and Europe and North America, but mainly from Europe. And so many of these places in Europe where Salafism or Takfiri ideology was being promoted, they became the centers to cultivate people to send to Turkey, and then they would send them into Syria. And many complained. Families of, I know families in the UK that saw this process taking place. They went to the police, and the police said, don't worry about it. We know what's going on. We're taking care of this, or we're dealing with it. But they allowed it to continue. Why? Because it was a policy to recruit young people, naive people, who were through this enormous amount of oil and gas wealth from Qatar, from other countries back then. Remember, this was before Mohammed bin Salman. So Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, a lot of money was being spent across Europe, across the region, in Pakistan, across the world, to spread this Salafist ideology, this Wahhabism, which was obscure, by the way, which was never mainstream in the Islamic world. It came from Najd and a region in Saudi Arabia, which was which this ideology was very powerful, but it didn't. It was really oil wealth that made it spread, and then later gas wealth replaced the oil wealth in spreading it. So you had people being recruited from across the world, coming from these cultural centers, I'll call them, and And then you had you had huge amount of TV channels. It's not just official ones like Al Jazeera and Al Arabi and others, but Qatar and Saudi Arabia and others were funding enormous amounts of media outlets, enormous numbers of media outlets, which were promoting Takfiri ideology, sectarian hatred. They would spread misinformation about sects, about other people, about groups to create this religious hatred. And they were all allowed to broadcast on through satellite, and uh, no Western government had any problem with the sectarianism and the hatred that was being broadcast. So you had this huge apparatus, media apparatus that was being funded by oil and gas wealth. And then you had this huge network across the world, which was now being deployed to bring in fighters. And so in 2013, when Iran saw these tens of thousands of foreign fighters in Syria, which were overrunning the country, the Iranians felt that they had to get involved. And that's when Hezbollah and Iran began to get involved in Syria, 2013. 2 years after this began, and almost 2 years after the email or a year and a half after Jake Sullivan's infamous email to Hillary Clinton. So Syria, which was very close to Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Turkey in particular, because as I said, the former President Assad and Mr. Erdogan would go on family vacations together. That never existed between any Iranian leader and the Syrian president at that time. Now, I don't want to go through the dirty war and all that, but I'll fast forward to what we have today. So ultimately, Syria fell. And this media apparatus and this enormous wealth helped to create this environment where many people celebrated the fall of Syria. Many in the West, they pretended that in the West, they did call, in the United States, they did make Golani, who was one of the co-founders of ISIS, who was the head of Al Qaeda in Syria, and the head of ISIS in Syria, because he was sent to Syria by the Islamic State of Iraq, which later became ISIS, to create the Al Qaeda branch in Syria, and then they had differences and they split. I'm not going to go there. So he was a terrorist, according to U.S. law, but they cooperated with him, but through third parties, as they do. So it was not as if they were out to kill him. They were helping him. They would use the so-called Free Syrian Army, which had very little influence in Syria and Turkey and Jordan, and they would fund these groups, and those groups would hand over the weapons to ISIS and Al Qaeda and their affiliates to do the real fighting. And we have to keep in mind, there's all sorts of things that I could point out, but one was that a footnote that I think is important was that the U.S. Secretary of State at that time, Kerry, he said in a leaked audio that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on the Syrian government and Assad. It's out there. You can find it. Your viewers can find it on it. And so they were allowed to fight. They were called terrorists, but they were allowed to fight. Now, after Syria fell and Al Qaeda and ISIS came to power, we saw that how the Western media, they began to rebrand, or it began before, but they rebranded these forces. And of course, Golani was removed from the terror list, and then the sanctions were removed altogether. Which of course, that is the only good thing about this. The sanctions against Syria were illegitimate, and there was a war being waged against ordinary Syrians, and it's completely unjustified. But then the reason why they removed the sanctions was because they supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda. ISIS and Al-Qaeda were their tools from the very beginning. And this is something that a lot of people should think about. The people who were supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic world and among Muslims in the West, who are now outraged about what the Israeli regime is doing, they were pursuing a policy that was in line with Israeli interests. They were pursuing a policy that was being guided by the United States. And so what they did was basically, wittingly or unwittingly, they strengthened the Israeli regime since 2011. And I would argue that if Syria had not been weakened during this decade and a half, the Israeli regime would not have been able to score any of the successes that they did. Although I believe that the Israelis have lost over the last 21 months, much more than they've gained. But we've discussed that before. But the successes that they did have were largely because these people helped the Americans pursue a policy of destroying Syria, and we are seeing the results now. Golani, as we expected from day one, when he came to power, was going to do a deal with the Israelis. It was clear because from the very beginning, he was supported by the West. And we saw that process take place. And Golani began to negotiate through Turkey. And I'll get to Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, shortly. And sorry for this very long answer. But Golani began to work to try to create a good relationship with the Israeli regime. He sent many messages saying that, look, we have only two enemies, and our two enemies are your two enemies, Iran and Hezbollah. Obviously. And even in his speech that last night, or the other night, after the Israelis bombed Syria, the night before last, or early in the morning, he basically, thanked the United States and the Arab countries and Turkey for trying to bring an end to this attack by Israel. So the United States is a force for good, apparently, in the eyes of Mr. Golani. So he tried his best. And what happened, though, was that there was the Turks facilitated, by their own admission, they were facilitating good talks, a good relationship between Israel and Golani through direct and indirect negotiations. The latest of which was in the Republic of Azerbaijan and Baku, which is another close ally of the Israeli regime. It sends oil through Turkey to Israel throughout this Holocaust in Gaza. Turkey and Azerbaijan have been key in supporting the Israeli regime's military through trade, but most importantly through the fuel an inexpensive fuel that they sent to Israel. So he has been in contact with the Israeli regimes. He's been trying to court the Israeli regime. But what happened was that there was an agreement for Golani's troops to move into Sueda and into southern Syria. But then the Israeli regime, there are two views. One is that the Israeli regime saw that they were bringing in heavy weapons, and that was not a part of the deal. And so they began to strike. Then there's this second view that the Israeli regime used this as an excuse, saying that they brought in heavy weapons, but they really intended to strike anyway. I tend to believe the second version, that the Israeli regime wanted to cut Golani down to size, and that on the one hand, they want to keep Syria weak, and they are also trying to they're trying to put the Druze in a position where they feel that they have no one but Israel to turn to. And so what the Israeli objective has always been, to break up Syria and to turn it to Balkanize Syria. Turkey, on the other hand, and Erdogan in particular, because I don't want to say Turkey, because Turkey is a country with a huge population and very differing views on different issues. Even in the AK party of Erdogan, many are opposed to him, many people I know, and what he does. Turkey, on the other hand, does not have the intention to hurt Israel. Turkey does trade with Israel. They have trade. They have business relations. The last time I was in Istanbul airport, there were direct flights, Turkish Airways to the Israeli regime. They do trade, business. They have diplomatic ties, and they of course export oil, or they transport oil. Most important, well, another important thing was that when the Yemeni armed forces blocked the Red Sea, some of the goods that the Israelis needed that they had no access to went through Egyptian ports, and others came from Turkey. So they helped them replace those things that they needed and couldn't access through the Red Sea. Turkey, what Erdogan, I should say, Erdogan wants to do is he wants to have his own sphere of influence. He wants to have this sort of mini Ottoman Empire. So he wants to have a sphere of influence in Syria, in Iraq, and in the Caucasus. And we've seen how he's done that. He's tried to. He has huge amounts of bases in northern Iraq. He has a huge ISIS and Al Qaeda are affiliated to him. They're basically controlled by him to a large degree. They have been over the years. Actually, Serena Sheem, the journalist, she was killed or murdered on the Turkish-Syrian border when she exposed the fact that the World Food Organization trucks were being used by Turkish intelligence to send troops and weapons inside Syria. And then the Turkish intelligence said that she's a spy. She immediately on that day she said on live TV she said they said I'm a spy, and I'm not. I'm just reporting the truth. And then as she was leaving, a truck hit her and killed her. It's a coincidence. So Turkey and Israel have parallel expansionists, or Erdogan and Israel have parallel expansionist ambitions. Turkey wants it in the north of Syria, north of Iraq, the Caucasus, and Israel, of course, wants southern Syria, parts of Lebanon, and of course, it can go as far as the Greater Israel Project wants to go, hypothetically. So there are friction points between Turkey and Israel, but Turkey definitely does not want to get into any trouble, or Erdogan does not want to get into any serious trouble with the Israeli regime. And that's why he's done nothing for Syria, despite the fact that the Israelis have been slaughtering people. But what Erdogan and Qatar have done is that they've created this culture of takfiri, this takfiri ideology. They spread this takfiri ideology after the Saudis and others have sort of distanced themselves from it for their own reasons. And that is helping the Israelis destroy Syria, because the hatred that they've created among many people in Syria towards minorities, towards the Kurds, the Alawites, the Druze, the Christians, the Shia, the Sufis, secular Sunnis, that has contributed to a great deal of what we're seeing. The crimes that are being committed in southern Syria by Golani's forces and these Israeli-backed Druze forces are outrageous. But they do originally come from this takfiri culture of coming from Salafism and Wahhabism that has created this hatred where both the ISIS and Al Qaeda forces and many of these Druze forces, uh, make them come to this conclusion where they feel they can slaughter women and children and and celebrate at the same time, or ISIS and Al Qaeda can take sex slaves from Alawite neighborhoods and so on. So it's very complicated here. It's very sad. It was interestingly, Ashara or Jolani, in his speech, he said, we want to return Syria to its greatness. Well, this country, Syria, the country itself is not a very old country. If he wants to, he's basically implying that before the Dirty War, it was a much better place than after he and his people destroyed it.
Well, when when Assad was toppled, I was making the point that perhaps the foundation for this partnership between the Israelis, the Turks, Americans, Europeans, and different Gulf states would come to an end because of the different objectives for post-Assad Syria. And I guess that's, as you mentioned, that Turkey, they would like to see a more unified Syria within its territorial, current territorial boundaries, which would then be function as a vassal for Turkey, while, as you said, Israel would like to see a split, a Balkanized Syria, where Israel can also snatch a little bit of territory as well, set up some protectorates within what used to be Syria then. It does appear, though, that the United States wants to bridge some of these different goals, as when now Golani, Israel is bombing the new authorities in Syria. Washington suggests that this was a misunderstanding, which is an interesting way of framing the attack. But also now that the Israelis will use the Druze community as a pretext for some kind of a humanitarian mission, if you will, to set up a protectorate or even possible future annexation. This seems, again, like an instrument in the splitting up of Syria. But this also then creates some tensions with the objectives of the European Union, it seems, because when Golani was slaughtering, or still is slaughtering, Alawites, the first thing the EU did was to suggest that the Alawites had provoked this themselves, so effectively providing political cover for the slaughter. Now, if Israel now says that it has to enter, which it is entering with its forces, to help the Druze community, that makes it very difficult for the Europeans and the Americans to suggest that Golani is this reformed, former terrorist leader who now cares about all of Syria. So it just seems like the dividing lines will be very difficult to brush over. So to what extent is it possible that this breaks into more open tensions now that Israel is bombing Syria? At what point would the Turks begin to push back or intervene against Israel, or would the United States have to then push against Turkey? Did you see this as this begins, or possibly begins, to unravel? Do you see any likely future scenario here?
Well, a couple of things. First, one is that the Israelis obviously don't care about the Druze. There are Druze in Israel who actually have been a part of the occupation force. Some of them have been involved in great atrocities in both Gaza, but also the West Bank. But some of the Druze population in the within the Israeli realm, the Israeli regime, they they don't have they don't they have sympathies with the surrounding states and the Palestinians. Don't consider themselves to be a part of this Zionist project. But if the Israeli regime really cared about the Jews in Syria, they would not have been supporting Golani and both Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, because the most sectarian, the most brutal, uh, uh, actually, Golani is very similar to Netanyahu, and his people are very similar to Zionists because they're supremacists. They consider others as subhuman. They think they can kill anyone they like, and through this ideology, this takfiri ideology, which unfortunately has broad influence across the region and beyond to different degrees. To different degrees, there are different degrees of sectarianism. There's the subtle sectarianism and that spread in officially and throughout, outlets like Al Jazeera and other no, known Batati outlets or other known outlets affiliated to Erdogan. And a lot of those outlets in Turkey that are controlled by the Turkish government are funded by Qatar. And that's another story. But so this subtle sectarianism exists at some levels, and then when you go deeper in, it becomes much more extreme and much more similar to Zionism, and also in the way in which they behave, as we've seen. So, and then in order to justify what they do, they project, just like the Zionists project everything on the Palestinians or on Hezbollah. They also project it on the minorities and others who do not adhere to ISIS and Al Qaeda ideology. But in any case, so if Israel really cared about the Druze, they wouldn't have been supporting ISIS and Al Qaeda alongside the Syrian occupied Jolan since 2011 and 12 and so on. The second point is that the fact that the Americans said that this was a misunderstanding, this alludes to what I was saying earlier, and that there was an agreement for Golani to send his troops into the south. But the Israelis were saying they're bringing in heavy weapons, and this was not a part of the agreement. I don't buy that. I think the Israeli regime meant to let these people come in and then um, destroy them. So the coordination that the Turks helped break, that this relationship that the Turkish government helped create between Golani and Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu's plan was to strike these people, or if it wasn't initially to strike, then he was convinced by his coalition partners to do so, and he did so. And then there's a third element, and that is that personally, I think this was a major mistake by the Israeli regime, because bombing another capital unprovoked, and the image, of bombing the Ministry of Defense and people saw it happen live. It just shows the world that the Israeli regime is this outlaw and rogue regime that it is. It further reinforces that. I don't think this is good for the regime. And it shows that countries like Turkey, who've never done anything to hurt Israel, and ISIS and Al Qaeda, which have never hurt Israel and have always been friendly to the Israelis, that they are never going to be treated any differently than the real resistance. The Israeli regime doesn't, and of course the forces that support it in the West, they're never going to allow anyone to have any sense of security in this region if it does not conform entirely with Israeli regime interests. So no matter what, I mean, Turkey under Erdogan has really done huge favors for Netanyahu. Because, for example, if Turkey had broken off ties with the Israeli regime, that would have made it, that would have helped create a an incentive for others, or strengthen the will of others to also boycott the Israelis, or to cut off ties, or to decrease ties. But when Turkey is doing business as usual, exporting goods, exporting fuel, how can one expect African countries or Latin American countries or Asian countries to take any action against the regime? when the Emirates is doing business as usual. I mean, these countries have played a huge role in strengthening Netanyahu's hand during the last 21 months. But despite that, and despite the fact that ISIS and Al Qaeda have never targeted Israel, they've targeted Russia, they've targeted Iran, they've targeted Syria, they've targeted Iraq, but they never target Israel. And rarely in the West have they targeted anyone else, but any of these people. But those were most probably rogue elements. But anyway, but they never targeted Israel. Or if they were not rogue elements, they never targeted Israel. But in any case, uh, the Israeli regime has done itself no favors, but because it has shown itself to be rogue, but it has also shown that Turkey and and Golani they are not going to be treated any differently. But I don't believe that under Erdogan, Turkey has any incentive to get into any direct conflict with the Israeli regime, because the priority of Turkey under Erdogan, it has never been Palestine. It has never been the Palestinian issue. For Turkey, for Erdogan is to expand to become more Ottoman-like. And that is why he and Netanyahu have had similar interests, and that is to weaken the resistance. So destroying Syria, weakening Hezbollah, that is all good for Erdogan. Weakening Yemen, that's all good for. In Yemen, Erdogan has been supporting forces that are opposed to Ansarullah and the Yemeni government. The only place where Erdogan has had a supportive role is with Hamas, but he's never provided them with ammunition or to help them build the military infrastructure that they have. As we speak, Iran is continuing to support Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. The person who was in charge was one of the people who was murdered by the Israelis, General Izadi. But he's, of course, been replaced by someone else who's doing. But the point is that Turkey, what it has been doing under Erdogan, is that it gives Palestinian scholarships. It gives, space for Hamas to have offices there. But it doesn't do anything against Israel. And I have no doubt, in the case of Qatar, for example, if the Americans told Qatar to shut down Al Jazeera, they'll shut it down. I mean, Qatar is where CENTCOM is based, and the base is funded by Qatar. So I don't see a scenario where the Israelis, the Erdogan is going to come into direct conflict with the Israeli regime. There are differences of interest, but there has always been a lot of mutual interests. And, at the end of the day, if anyone really says, no, this is not the case, they have to answer, why is it that we've had direct flights during this Holocaust between Istanbul and Tel Aviv. We've had the flow of oil continue. We've had trade. It's clear as day that, and of course, both of them were a part of this timber sycamore project that evolved into something very huge. It's clear as day that the Turkish government under Erdogan is very much in the NATO camp. It is, and he is not going to do anything that is going to create a real wedge between the United States and Turkey, as he has never done so in the past. Whenever he's made some small moves, the United States has punished him, and he pulled back. But his interests, the interests of Netanyahu and Erdogan, are largely in parallel with each other, and so there are certain conflict notes. But there's no doubt that if push comes to shove in those areas, the West is going to be behind Israel, not Turkey, and Erdogan is not going to stand up to Israel in those areas. So I think that he's going to continue to be very cautious, and he's going to preserve his ties with Netanyahu.
Well, my last question is just with Golani and Israel. How long can this continue? Because again, as you said, Israel bombs Syria, the capital, and and his first response reportedly is to try to reassure Israel that as they're being bombed, that well, our only enemies are Iran and Hezbollah. Um, at some point, he must recognize that that Israel is not in support of him running a strong, unified Syria. So, and if he doesn't respond well to this reality that Israel, once it's weakened and divided, at some point he's going to lose control over his men. I mean, how much punishment can they take before they begin to reassess their seemingly undying loyalty to Israel? How do you see anything here?
Glenn, a number of things have happened over the last couple of days, which I find interesting in Iran and in Lebanon. And I want to sort of respond to you first by going through these two. In Iran, there has always been this camp that says that, if we just did a deal with Americans, and I mean, look at Syria. That's what they've been saying for months. Look at Syria. Now that they've struck a deal, now that they've overthrown, I mean, it's Al Qaeda and ISIS, true, horrible people. And the worst of the worst, very similar to Zionists themselves. If they could, get their hands on us, they'd cut off our heads. But they did a deal with the West, and the sanctions have been removed. So maybe if we did a deal with the West, the sanctions would be removed. That has been a narrative that has been going on since the fall of the previous Syrian government. People looked at, their TV, and these people saw that doing a deal is not enough. They'll still come after you. You can tell, Golani has been, shaving his beard, wearing ties, uh, you know, dealing with the devil, going to, place after place and telling the Israelis, we're friends and our enemy, we have, our enemies are the same enemies, and they'll still bomb him. They'll still bomb his people. They'll still bomb the people who they've been funding and supporting. You can't do a deal with the Israeli regime. This has reinforced the position of Ayatollah Khamenei and all those who've been saying that the United States, the Israeli regime, the collective West, you cannot deal with them. In Lebanon, it has strengthened Hezbollah because people are now saying, more people, many of the people who were saying, and this I know because I've been speaking to people in Lebanon during the last couple of days, many people who have been saying that Hezbollah has to give up its weapons are now saying we need these weapons. Because this, you have Golani slaughtering the Druze and the Israelis bombing Damascus unprovoked. So if if the resistance is disarmed in Lebanon, nothing is there to protect us from the Salafi Takfiris or the Zionists, the genocidal Zionists. And so that has strengthened the resistance in Lebanon among the Druze, among moderate Sunnis. Because remember, Salafists and Wahhabism, as I said earlier, they are new on the scene. They only came in since it really began in Afghanistan, where the Americans started using, and they used Saudi Arabia and the Emirates back then to fund the extremists to fight the Soviet Union, but also to contain the revolution in Iran. Revolution in Iran was anti-imperialist, calling for, the Americans to leave the region, anti-colonialists. And so they started funding these Takfiri groups to create hatred for Shia, so it was like dual purpose. But the first books that were published, Takfiri books that were being taught at school or in madrasas for children in Afghan children and children in parts of Pakistan, were published in the United States by
If I'm not mistaken,
Nebraska Oberham University Press. So, Omaha University Press. So, uh, so that has taught a lot of people a lesson in Lebanon and in Iran, a further lesson. But also in Syria, it's going to become complicated because the Takfiris are creating this hatred and mass hatred, and they're trying to indoctrinate this hatred among kids and young people in Syria, just like Zionists do toward, with children in Jewish children in Palestine. They create hatred, so that they're indoctrinated from childhood, what the Salafis and the Wahhabis are doing. But in Lebanon, many moderate Sunnis, they are traditional Sunnis. They don't believe in this, and they're afraid of it. And Christians too. So it is strengthening the argument of the resistance in Lebanon to keep their arms against the Israeli regime, to protect the country from the Israeli regime and those Salafi Wahhabi forces that have been controlled by NATO for decades. Inside Syria, it is going to create problems for these forces that the West has been supporting. Because on the one hand, they're intolerant, but on the other hand, they are subordinate, but they're not reaping the benefits of their subordination. So there's this major problem growing. They're slaughtering minorities. They're slaughtering moderate Sunnis, Sufi Sunnis. They are taking sex slaves from minorities, the Alawites in particular. But they're being bombed and they're not responding. They're not going to attack the Israelis. They're going to attack the Druze. Again, the Israelis are trying to do their best to turn the Druze, have them turn to the Israeli regime. And this is very dangerous. Syria, the Balkanization of Syria is exactly what the Israeli regime wants. And that is why, under no circumstances, should it be Balkanized. I mean, that's one reason. The other reason is Syria is Syria. People should live together. But I think that this is not going to go well for the Israeli regime. I've argued this from the beginning, as you know, that this 21 months has been one catastrophe for Israel after another. They have destroyed so much of our region. They've destroyed country after country. They've carried out a Holocaust. They're slaughtering people in Iran and Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere. But I think that this is all catastrophic for the Israeli regime. And in fact, I think is because of the stupidity of the Israelis. And here some may disagree, but I think if Israel had not done what it has done over the past 21 months, this whole Epstein issue that's now becoming big in the United States would not have become like this. The issue of Mossad, I mean, it would have been an issue, but not like this. When so many people in the United States are turning against Israel and seeing what they're just bombing Damascus unprovoked and carrying out this genocide. And at the same time, this piece of garbage, Epstein and his friends and allies are cooperating with this regime and carrying out such great corruption in the United States and capturing the political order through the donors and through others who were involved with Epstein and many of the other Epsteins. I have no doubt that there are many other Epsteins out there who are busy doing their work. I mean, the girls that were given out to Epstein were given out to other people too. And I'm sure it's continued. But in any case, I think that what Netanyahu is doing, him and his coalition, is that they're further making the Israeli regime hated. And I think they are legitimizing, or should I say, they're reinforcing the resistance and that they're telling the world that the resistance was right. You have to bear arms against the Israeli regime. You can never trust it. They'll never let you live, no matter how much you help them in killing their enemies or undermining the resistance. They will still not treat you as human beings. And so ultimately, what I think is that what will happen in Syria is that people will say, well, under Hezbollah was a lot, Iran, Hezbollah, they were right. The resistance was right. What happened to Syria during the last 15 years has only made things worse for us. And we're not going to be protected because the Israelis will never treat us as equals. So I think that this is not going to work well for Israel at all. I'm not saying that Golani is going to be undermined tomorrow. I'm not saying that these Takfiri monsters, especially those from Central Asia and China and elsewhere, really awful, or like the worst of the worst among them. Thousands of people the plan is to keep them as tools for NATO later on when they want to undermine Asia and Asian growth. But I think it's not going to end well this is not good news for them. And so while the Israeli regime and I think one reason why Netanyahu may be doing this now is that there is a possibility for a ceasefire in Gaza. And this may help him to be strong. And you do know that his trial was delayed again. Every time the trial comes up, there's some sort of war that's carried out. So I think that maybe this could help him have the ceasefire and preserve his coalition at the same time. But I don't think it's the end of Netanyahu aggression.
Well, that's a fascinating point, though, how Israel might be, and the US for that sake, might be alienating potential allies in the region as the potential for actual reliable partnership goes out the window. And as you said, this probably applies among the opposition in Iran as well. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. This is, as always, very fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure being on your show, and I hope to see you soon.